Welcome back, my friends, for another Naval History edition of the Proceedings Podcast. I'm Eric Mills, Editor-in-Chief of Naval History Magazine. Glad to be with you. Support for the Proceedings Podcast comes from General Dynamics Electric Boat, which has a 126-year legacy of delivering the submarines our nation needs to defend our freedoms. Which has a 126-year legacy of delivering the submarines our nation needs to defend our freedoms and those of our allies. To ensure our nation's defense now at this critical time in history, GDEB is investing in the next generation of shipbuilding and infrastructure to answer the call. It was EB then, and it's EB now. Learn more at gdeb.com/about/EB now. And we are here to discuss what is actually kind of a nice winter's read on a cold day like this, if you have a nice fire to sit in front of. A medieval saga, which is our cover story of our January-February issue, currently out at newsstands of Naval History. This is about the Vikings, great seafarers of old, and interestingly enough, their participation of all things, the Crusades to the Holy Land. Here to talk about this is our ever stalwart contributor, Sam Tangredi, who has written about other medieval topics for Naval History Magazine, in addition to his work as a well-known modern naval thinker. So Sam, welcome back. It's great to have you. Love the article. Maybe people would be interested to know about what prompted you to become interested in the topic of the Vikings and their role in the Crusades, etc.
Well, thanks, Eric. I have a personal philosophy in the work that I do in my day job, which is all on future warfare, that you cannot understand the future if you have not studied the past. Now, I recognize the Crusades from the far past, but I was always interested in them when I was a boy, like many others, reading stories of the Middle Ages, knights, castles, that sort of things, Crusades. And that was kind of typical in the period that I was growing up. But I think it's still true for a lot of people. Witness the interest in the TV show Game of Thrones, which is basically the medieval period put into a different setting, a fantasy setting. Anyway, I was always interested in the Crusades, and but if you read about the Crusades, rarely ever do they mention naval operations, the sea, the maritime world. If you read most of the standard works on the Crusades, it's all about land warfare, but also about the First Crusade moving a lot of troops and on land all the way through Europe, through the Byzantine Empire to the Holy Land, but very little about the maritime world involved in it. And I think that I like to research on under-researched areas, on areas that others have not looked at. And it's only been recently, like in the 1980s, that scholars started to take a look at the maritime operations of the Crusades. So I've been fascinated by that. And one of the reasons that one of the big influences on the study of Crusades was a series of books, 3 volumes, written in the 1950s by Sir Stephen Runciman. Now, if you look at those volumes, you see practically nothing about the sea. Now, Runciman was one of those great, wealthy English professional amateurs like Julian Corbett. And he pretty much defined the understanding of the Crusades for many years. And it's not till recently, 80s and so, that Jonathan Riley Smith and some other scholars started saying, oh, the Crusader states were sustained by sea. The Crusades could not happen if they were not resupplied by sea. Many of these operations required naval operations in order to be conducted. And now there are a number of scholars, John Pryor from Australia, who's written articles on that, but nobody's really done a book on it yet. And also I take that back. There are some scholarly books, but thus far there's no one who has written a popular history of the maritime operations of the Crusades. So I thought, maybe some years from now, I would like to do that. And then working with you, the idea came, well, maybe I could talk about some of these operations as individual articles. And so that's what I'm doing.
Mhm.
One of the things I just want to point out before we continue discussion is for many years, study of Crusades presents a lot of contradictions. For many years, up until recently and up until 9/11, the consensus based on Runciman was that this was a very brutal, almost colonialism by the Europeans in that area, which is a completely different interpretation in past ages, where it was looked as a reestablishment of what was in fact Christian territory by the Christians in order to allow pilgrims to go to the sites in the Holy Land. Well, after 9/11, it swung back. The focus on the religious aspect swung back. And now we look at it and recognize that those involved were very serious about what they thought their faith was, and that they were doing this for their faith. Most of the Crusaders gained nothing by it whatsoever. Many of the nobles who went on sold property and stuff to be able to finance them going on crusades. And after they had fought and thought they achieved whatever their objectives, they came home. And so the Crusades is a fascinating period because a lot of things that people think about it in modern terms are not necessarily, they're approximately correct. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, I share your fascination with this period in history, and it's been such an eye opener to run the series of articles from you, of which this is the latest, that focus on sea power elements and different aspects of the Crusades. It's fascinating stuff, and I hope it all comes together in this book someday that you speak of. It's a brilliant book idea. Like you say, it has not been done in this form yet, and I think the world would be the path to the door of a book like that. You're right. There's an abiding public fascination in this period. And it's interesting you say how there's sort of I don't want to say a misconception, but a framing of the Crusades as being all about gain. It was like manifest destiny, cloaked in religious language, but it's really for gain. I think a lot of that comes from the popular fascination with the Knights Templar. And I'm interested to hear your take on this, because they famously become quite wealthy as a side effect of their involvement in the Crusades. They're credited with inventing the modern banking system, hostels, like youth hostels you stay in along the way, all this. And they amassed a great fortune, which of course will lead to their downfall because of the greedy French king. But I wonder if that's part of the popular conception of this is just a materialistic thing. And it really is just one sort of aspect of it with one particular holy order of knights that were going there.
Well, yeah, it is. But I mentioned Steve Runciman in the beginning. And Runciman was one of these people who he was expert on the Byzantine Empire. He started at Cambridge studying that, and then he received a great inheritance, millions. So what he did is he kind of left that and spent his time writing, and his focus was on the Byzantine Empire. But he was also, I don't know if you would call him a Marxist, but he was a materialist who did not believe that, he really didn't believe that the Crusaders were motivated by faith, because he didn't see humans as being that motivated by faith. And also, he loved the Byzantine Empire, and he blamed the Crusaders for destroying the Byzantine Empire. So if you read his books, the Crusaders are portrayed as ignorant, brutal, rapacious, and motivated, just like you've said, for gain. But that was part of his political framework. And that's the thing about history. No historian is truly unbiased, because we all have a different worldview. So you have that element. Then you have the other element of the view that this was European colonialism against the Muslims. Of course, not mentioned was that that territory was nominally Christian until the 600s, in which the Arabs came and conquered it. And then 400 years later, you have the Europeans coming and conquering it back. But the interesting thing, and this is something that a lot of people don't realize, is that for Arab historians, Muslim historians, up until the late 1800s, the Crusades were not important. If you read Arab histories which focused on dynastic struggles, the struggles between the Shia and the Shiites and the others, up until about the late 1800s, the Arab historians paid very little attention to the Crusades. It was something that happened. It was happening for a couple hundred years, but look, we're looking at 1,000 years of or more of Muslim history, and that was just a piece. What happened was that a number of the Arab scholars supporting who opposed the French, British, and all these European colonial powers interfering in the Middle East found this as a topic that they could compare to what was happening then. And suddenly the Crusades became a big deal in the Muslim Arab kind of imagination that it never had been before. So when Osama bin Laden said something like, Crusaders, this and that, that whole perspective is not something that comes all the way from religious teaching in Islam, although there's connection there. But that perspective is kind of came from the anti-colonial age, or the age of colonialism. They suddenly remembered. A great example is, might remember Saddam Hussein had put up statues of the great Saracen leader Saladin, who fought King Richard the Lionheart and others during the Third Crusades. And he put this up, and he wanted to be seen as Saladin and stuff. But he never mentioned that Saladin was a Kurd, the people that he did the most to try to gas or persecute, and that part's not mentioned.
Inconvenient little detail there.
Right. So if Saladin was right around that period, he would have probably been fighting against Saddam Hussein. The notion of the Crusades are fascinating because they're never one thing, in the sense that, we perceive them, this is a religious war between Christianity and Islam. Well, yes, it is. But when you get to the details, you find that it becomes a war of princes. You have, in the later period of the Crusader states, you had Christian nobles allied with Muslim emirs to fight other Muslim emirs. At one point, you had Christian nobles allied with Muslim emirs to fight Christian nobles. This is a very complex thing. Also, during much of the existence of Crusader states, you had Muslim populations living under the rule of the Crusader nobles. And I've gone through all the Arab literature, the contemporary Arab literature about the time, and there's several of the Arab chroniclers who complain very bitterly. They say the Muslim population will not, rise up against the Christian overlords because the Christians charge them less taxes than their Muslim overlords used to. So it's a fascinating period. And it's also, we think of people as changing. We think of us as so different than the people that age. But in reality, we're very similar to those people. We just have more sophisticated toys. That's basically it. All the human aspect of it, running from nobility, spiritualism, all the way to greed and quest for power. That's all happening, and that happens today too.
That's a universal truth there, Sam. It's one of the insights of history too, isn't it? See, that's fascinating just in itself, that it's much more multi-layered and nuanced than it's just they wanted to go take it over and expel the Muslims. In fact, they just wanted to make it safe for Christians to travel there to visit the sites, which doesn't necessarily mean expelling the existing population. It means you're there to kind of oversee it.
Right.
That's very
And,
interesting to hear. And
and
it's
it's
also very interesting, and this speaks to human nature, how it doesn't become relevant to Islamic oriented history until it's analogous for the current situation when the great powers are colonizing that part of the world. And that kind of makes sense. Suddenly, this is kind of reminiscent to something in their past they hadn't really given a whole lot of thought to. But
right.
let's get to the Vikings now. We wanted to talk about the Vikings here, and because that's also another endlessly fascinating topic for both scholars and the general readership alike. So let's talk about how they became part of this whole crusade movement. And in fact, I'll let you tell the story, but the first actual reigning monarch of Europe to personally take part in the Crusades was a Viking. And this is his story, correct? I leave it to you to regale the viewers and listeners.
Okay. One of the things that you have to first, I want to start with the sources. How do we know this whole thing happened? There's a whole number of sources that we actually have. There's at least 4 written in Norwegian, sometime between the mid 1100s and 1250. The most significant one is called Heimskringla, or the Chronicle of the Kings of Norway, and that was written by Snorri Sturluson, who was actually Icelandic, kind of a writer, a poet, and also a political leader too. Interesting story. He was exiled for a while there in Norway, went back against the wishes of the Norwegian king, was assassinated, as well as being basically a skald, one who took all this poetry together and created a history from it, from all the poetry and songs of people's memory. So that's one, and there's at least 4 other or 3 other Norwegian histories, but also it appears in histories elsewhere, in England, in France, and there's a lot of commentary about it. So we do have a pretty accurate, if not accurate, but a pretty consistent view. So this is not just a saga of Vikings. This is something that other people in Europe had acknowledged that happened. Now, the Vikings became nominally, well, the Norwegians or all the Scandinavians became nominally Christian starting about the year 900 or 800. And it happened in the same way as Constantine the Great kind of adopted Christianity. That is, it was viewed by them as the religion of success. They kind of understood it, but they thought that this one God and manifested in Jesus Christ would give them victory over those other people who were believing in all these gods and Odin and Thor and whatever. And they were successful. So that's how it started. At the same time, the European missionaries are there in Scandinavia. So eventually they are also converting the everyday people to it. But it had strong kingly backing. By the time Sigurd became king, which was in 1103, the official religion of Norway had been Christianity for about 100 years. But it was not, significant part of the population accepted it, but there was still a significant part of the population that was pagan. By accepting the crusade, by being willing to go on crusade, Sigurd actually reinforced the official acceptance of Christianity. Now, being a nominal Christian and living the tenets of the faith, of course, in that period were two different things. They didn't stop, Viking practices simply because they had renounced Odin and the Norse gods and accepted the new Christian faith. That gradually occurred, but not in the 1100s. Sigurd and his two brothers were joint kings of Norway when their father died. Magnus Barefoot was their father, and he died fighting the Irish in Ireland. Once Sigurd took the cross to go on the crusade, he had to renounce the Viking, attacking other Christians. So he focused on, their focus then became, as Crusaders, attacking the Muslims and pagans. And so it was an interesting combination of going on a crusade to the Holy Land, yet conducting these raiding operations throughout against the non-Christians. Now, presumably the raiding operations supported the return of Christianity in Spain and other places, the Reconquista, but they also made a lot of money for these, which is generally the motivation for most of the Viking raids in the pagan era. So it's a fascinating thing.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing that was happening at the time, and this is kind of the context, is that the Scandinavians had already been traveling, even in the pagan periods, the Scandinavians had already been traveling through Russia down to be mercenaries in the Byzantine Empire. And that was kind of a two-way street in the sense that they would travel down, serve in the Varangian Guard of the Byzantine Emperor, and they were considered part of the most loyal force, even though they were mercenaries, to the emperor because they didn't owe allegiance to anything else in the Byzantine Empire. So the Vikings traveled down there. Meanwhile, they're establishing kingdoms in what is now Ukraine, and that traveled down there and made money, and then traveled back up into Scandinavia, where they told wonderful, amazing stories about what they had seen in the East. And that created a great desire for many of the male population of Scandinavia to say, oh, we want to go on the similar adventures. That corresponded with Sigurd's decision to go on a crusade because you had a whole bunch of available manpower that wanted to go adventuring in that period, in that era. So basically, as Snorri Sturluson said, there was a group of Norwegians who wanted to go adventuring into the Mediterranean, into the Holy Land, and they wanted one of their kings to lead them. And so it ended up being Sigurd. And so he took the oath as a crusader, and it became a crusade. So the influence of the previous experience, combined with some degree of religious fervor, came together.
And what makes this a bona fide saga, if you will, a hero's journey in fictive terms, an epic undertaking, is they don't just go to the Holy Land. There's a whole lot they do along the way. And it's like each chapter of this journey is a story unto itself. And that's one of the fascinating things about your piece. And if you haven't read it yet, folks, you'll see this in there. It's like it crams a whole lot of stuff into a feature-sized article that's just it's one thing after another, and it's all good. First off, they stop over in England, and let's talk about that, because now there's a relationship with the English monarchy line since the Norman invasion and whatnot, and I believe they're feted by the king himself. Let's talk about that.
Yes. That was Harold the First. The Who was the son of William the Conqueror. So the Normans, origin of the Normans was that Vikings in about the year 800 came down into France. They were a threat to the King of France, but at the time, France was not France. It was a whole bunch of different kingdoms and stuff. So basically, the King of France was the one who controlled Paris and that region. So they were a threat to him. So to buy them off, he gave them part of Normandy. And so they became, Rollo was the first who became the Duke of Normandy. And he was originally a Scandinavian Viking, became Duke of Normandy, with the King of France being the overlord. Although at that time, the King of France didn't have a lot of control over all these nominal subordinate dukes, princes, and the like. Anyway, during that period, from that 200 years, they transformed from a exclusively seagoing culture to very much a land culture, and they developed cavalry tactics, and they were, known for their strength as cavalry. William the Conqueror, who had a claim to the English throne, kind of a shaky claim, decided to go to England and defeat the King Harold there, Godwinson, who had a shaky claim to the throne too.
Yeah.
So the Normans came back into England. And although they were very much different by this period than the Vikings, they had Europeanized. They had they adopted a dialect of the French language. They still understood, though, that their heritage had been in Scandinavia. So when the Scandinavian king came, the King of England was very obliged to, since he was a fellow king, to provide the entertainment, the victuals, and support that over the winter. The Vikings did not sail during the winter if they could avoid it. Very rarely, particularly because of the type of ships that they sail. The long ships are not steady in major tough ocean conditions, high sea states. So they would winter. They would, voyage during the other seasons in winter. And it happened to be that they started their voyage in autumn and then only got to England by the time winter was setting in. And now people wonder, well, why did they start that late in the year? Usually the Viking operations work their way around planting season and harvest season, because most of the Vikings, as I say in the article, plundering was a second job. They ran farms. There were professional Vikings that's all they did, plundering. But for many of the followers of Sigurd, these were, it was a second job. These are young men going on adventure, getting away from the farm, so to speak. That went with him. And so anyway, one of the first episodes in the saga is visiting England, having good relations with the King of England. King of England, wanted to support the Crusades without going on one. So by helping supply the Norwegians, Sigurd's force, then he was doing something involving the Crusades, and maybe that would give him remission of sins, or good, as I put it, sort of get the remission of sins vibes from Sigurd himself. So they wintered there, and then they went on their voyage down towards Spain. And what I find in the sagas is trying to make sense of the chronology, the timeline, because there's nothing in it that said they went raiding on the coast of France. Yet it took them a very long time to go from England in the spring and end up in Galicia, which is the northwestern part, coastal region of Spain. It took them, they didn't get to Galicia till winter was setting again. So I'm trying to figure out what exactly were they doing? Why did it take that long? Is it maybe they left England later than the Saga say, or was he actually raiding in France? Although he had promised not to do that, I don't know. But he ended up in northwest Spain in the second winter of the Crusades, which took 3 years. It was a 3-year crusade. And then that was where he had the first noted battle hit. But it was actually against a Christian force, but his contemporaries would have considered justified. The Vikings got to this crusade got to northwestern Spain. It was winter. There wasn't going to be free entertainment. So they made a deal with one of the leading nobles in the region that they would, the noble in Galicia was the Kingdom of Leon at the time, would provide a market. That is like medieval markets, an ability for the Norwegians to buy food throughout the winter. But apparently, after the Christmas period, that stopped, which got Sigurd and his force very annoyed, since they weren't able to buy. They were actually purchasing the food. They weren't able to buy the food. Now, why that happened, I don't know. Maybe the market ran out of food or whatever. So what they did is they went and they took over the noble's castle, took all of his stuff, took his money too, and then went back out. So they had the food and so they gained their first profit. But his contemporaries would consider that justified because they would have argued that noble was supposed to provide a market. He failed. He did not live up to his contract. So, the Vikings came and took what they thought was theirs and more.
I have to wonder what he was thinking. Does he know who he's dealing with here?
I don't know, but according to all the sources, they said that he left his castle. Maybe he fled with his retainers, and then the Vikings, cleaned up whoever was left and took his stuff. And then once they did that, they went back to sail, and then came down from Galicia down to the along the coast of what is now Portugal, but what at the time was controlled by the Muslims, by the Saracens, by the Almohad dynasty. And so since these were non-Christians, Muslims, pagans, then Sigurd and his force were, off the hook as far as raiding was concerned. They could do it as part of this crusade. So they had several battles, and in fact, although there are some sources that say not, it seems to me that they coordinated with the Kingdom of Leon, which was trying to reconquer the region. Henry, the Count of Portugal, or the future Portugal, apparently collaborated with them, and they had three major battles in the region. One was in a place called Sintra. It's still a major kind of city in Portugal, on the Portuguese Riviera, a lot of tourism there, and then down to Lisbon. And in fact, they captured Lisbon, turned it over to Henry, Count of Portugal. Then they sailed down and they had another battle at a city, Alcázar, in what is now Portugal. And then after that, it was time to head towards the Mediterranean. They encountered a Saracen fleet. While the Vikings were raiding in the north region, what later were called the Barbary pirates, were doing the same thing in the Mediterranean and up the Atlantic. So you actually had these two, raiding forces meeting each other, and you have the conflict of religion, so you could invoke that too. So the Sigurd's force routinely defeated that. The interesting thing is that in Snorri Sturluson's version, and he wrote it about 1250 is when he's writing. So it's after the time, but he collected all the sources that were contemporary with Sigurd. The sources refer to the Saracens themselves as Vikings, because the term Viking was about raiders. The Norse Vikings referred to themselves as Norse or Norwegian. They accepted the fact that they were going a Viking, and then they kind of applied the same concept to the Muslims who were doing the same thing in the opposite direction. So they were able to defeat those fleet and eventually get in the Mediterranean. So basically, they fought 4 major battles before they even got to the Mediterranean, each of them having a very interesting aspect.
I was really fascinated by that part. I had never heard that other raiding parties, regardless of their background, were referred to just sort of generically as Vikings as well. Mm-hmm. So it must be very confusing to read we've got Vikings fighting Vikings, which is actually Vikings versus what would later be the Barbary pirates, which is that's kind of a neat story concept right there.
Right. Vikings, well, we look at the Scandinavians of the era and we call them all Vikings, but Viking had a very specific term, was a very specific term as they used it. These were the Scandinavians who were going raiding, who were going on adventures in far territories. That's them. They would not refer to the people who stayed home as Vikings. They were, Norse, Norwegian, Swedes, Danes, Goths, eventually Finns too. So that's the term they applied. So they applied that term to other peoples who were had the same occupation.
Interesting. So they're finally wending their way across the Mediterranean toward the target destination. How does that play out?
Well, they had they made landfall in the Balearic Islands, and they had 2 major at least 2 major battles that have been recorded there. Now you have to understand that the records of them were not made by historians; they were made by poets and singers. So those who performed in courts, performed for nobles, also performed for the peasants too. But so they needed exciting stories. So the saga is not an exact history. It is accurate as far as we can tell, but the focus is on the exciting story. So, for example, when they were made landfall at the island of Formentera, which is the smallest of the Balearic Islands, there was which was a pirate haven for the Muslim pirates, the Moors in particular, which was a population that was mixed race, mostly a mixed race population, because the Berbers of Africa came along with the Arabs, and so a mixed race population of pirates. So there was a cave on that island in which these pirates kept their treasure, and the Norwegians raided it and took the treasure away. And they did it by using the cave was designed in a way that you couldn't approach it successfully against a defended force, but the Vikings hung some of their boats down from the side of the cliff, putting forces in the boats so that they could rain arrows into the cave and push the pirates back. So this was an exciting adventure to sing about. So it got great press, so to speak. although it was kind of a minor skirmish in the big sense of things, certainly not as difficult as attacking Lisbon. So the Vikings did that sort of thing. They stopped in, according to the sagas, they stopped in Sicily as a guest of the young, who would become King Roger II of the Normans who had conquered southern Italy. And that part is a little bit unclear in the sense that the chronology doesn't work very well for that, because they ended up in the Holy Land. It was still spring. So somehow it took them from winter to winter just to go from England to Spain, but they were able to go from Lisbon all the way to Akko, and now in Israel, which was the main Crusader port, and it was still summer. So historians are still trying to work out the chronology, whether chronology was right or what actually happened there. But they made it to the Holy Land, and that's when, rather than looking at it as a crusade, it's often referred to as an armed pilgrimage, because once Sigurd got there, they became kind of the spiritual pilgrim. He visited sites associated with Jesus, with other stories of the Bible, was rebaptized in the Jordan, and that sort of thing. And so his battles were mostly on the way till he got there, and then it became this kind of armed pilgrimage where he was doing that. And the question, of course, is what were his men doing while he's traveling around to the various sites? He was collecting relics, religious relics to bring back to Norway and that sort of thing. I don't know what they're doing, but they were probably getting in trouble. So the then king of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, Baldwin, employed them in conquering Sidon, which is one of the port cities of the Levant that was still in the Muslim hands. So that's their main contribution to the actual Holy Land region, was the conquest of Sidon. But that was a relatively small part in the whole saga.
I wonder, did the Christian forces manage to hold and keep Sidon for any great length of time after that? We know, or
yes, well,
I
that
know
was
a lot of stuff changes hands back and forth.
Right. No, actually, Sidon was one of the last places that when the Crusaders were driven out, when the Crusade kingdoms were destroyed, and it was actually by the Mamluks of Egypt. That was one of their last footholds. If you go to Sidon, the waterfront is such that there's still remnants of a castle that sat right on the waterfront that could be, at that time, cut off from the mainland, from the rest of the city. And that was kind of one of the last refuges of the Crusaders. Once they were driven out, they went to Cyprus, which was in their hands. And the Knights Hospitaller, the kind of rivals to the Templars, controlled much of that. The Templars were there too. And basically the Crusade forces retreated into to Cyprus, is where they pulled out of Sidon, went there.
So the one place they did significantly capture did remain in Western hands, so to speak, till pretty much the end. That's noteworthy.
Yes, and Eric, sorry.
No, I was just going to please go ahead.
Oh, I was saying, and that episode actually kind of describes some of the Crusades. They captured Baldwin, and Sigurd captured the city, and they didn't expel the then Muslim population. Most of the population stayed. They did take the nobles, leaders, and hold them for ransom, and the sort of things you would do in any medieval war, whether you were in Europe or in the Levant. So the idea that the Crusades were a fight of extermination between two religions was never accurate. It was a very complex situation, but they held that, and that once that was done, Sigurd considered his crusade over. I mean, he achieved something. He saw all the places he wanted to see. He achieved something, and now it was time to head towards home. And he did that via Constantinople. He took the remnants of his force to Constantinople to visit with the Byzantine Empire, who was welcomed him, congratulated him on his great success, this whole thing. And Sigurd decided to travel back to Norway by land. And people say that's kind of odd for Vikings to want to travel back by land. But the reason was that most of his men decided to stay. They decided to join the Varangian Guard, go adventuring on their own. So when Sigurd actually got back to Norway, he only had about 100 followers with him. So, since it's estimated that he had somewhere up to 5,000 followers when they left, he actually only got back with 100. Now, a lot of them might have been killed along the way, of course, but there was a substantial portion that decided they wanted to stay in that region. These are young men seeking adventure.
Mm-hmm. And Constantinople is very welcoming to them. They love having them there. Like you say, they're the elite mercenary guard. And, they're wined and dined with great fanfare when they get there. You can see how that would hold some appeal. Like, I don't want to go home yet. It's going to be cold there. This is going to be pretty good for me. And he didn't hold that against him at all. The king. I mean.
No. And also you have to remember that the inheritance system was basically primogeniture. That is, the oldest son would inherit the family's wealth. So the younger sons had to go do something else. This was very true throughout the Crusades. Most of the Crusade knights were the younger sons of the nobility who weren't going to inherit anything. So they needed to go find their fortune in the world. Crusade was very convenient for them to go do that. Now, a lot of them ended up coming back. Most of them ended up coming back, but it was also an opportunity to go out and get property. I mean, it's standard medieval warfare. If you besieged the city and you conquered it, or even if the city surrendered, the treasure was yours. That was expected. And in fact, if the city surrendered, usually they kind of ransom themselves. They said, okay, we surrender to your authority, we accept your authority, and oh, by the way, here's how many, the Arab money was called bazants. This is how many bazants we're going to give you, and leave us alone. And that was routine medieval thing. So there was gain to be had, but that wasn't the primary motivator for most of the Crusaders. Now, in the case of Sigurd, I think that was the motivator for most of his force, most of his men. They came down adventuring. They want to get rich, and Sigurd himself didn't really. That wasn't his interest. He was going as an armed pilgrim to the Holy Land, demonstrating the importance of himself as the king of Norway. And then when he went back up through Europe, it was a diplomatic tour. He went and visited with the various kings and nobles until he got to Denmark. And then the king of Denmark, gave him ships to cross. He gave all the remaining ships to the Byzantine Empire that he had. The Saga says he took the prow of his longship, kind of dragon prow, which was gilded, and took it to the great cathedral of Constantinople, Hagia Sophia, and presented it as his demonstration of his Christian commitment. Now, today, as Christians, we wouldn't think slaughtering a lot of people is Christian commitment, but you have to put in context of the times.
We're talking the 12th century here. That's right.
Yes. You put it in context of the times. One of the reasons for the Crusades, and this is clear by modern scholars, is that the Pope wanted to get rid of these people out of Europe because these are young men, warriors, trained in combat. If they stay in Europe, they fight wars against each other. So one of the motives not admitted motive, but one of the motives of the popes in encouraging the Crusades was get these guys out of Europe, because the Pope wanted to achieve a Catholic peace in Europe. Sincerely wanted to end fighting in Europe. So how can you end fighting in Europe if you have all these rootless warrior trained nobles, along with all their men at arms retainers? If they're in Europe, they're fighting each other. And if you get them to fight outside of Europe against the Muslims for a holy purpose, then you've created kind of a zone of peace, so to speak. Mm-hmm. Now, it didn't quite work that way, but that was one of the ideas behind not just freeing the Holy Land, not just making it safe for the Christian pilgrims. And pilgrimage was a big thing in those days. I mean, people think that the medieval people did not travel. They traveled, mostly related to the Christian faith. Pilgrimages were a big thing. If you remember, the Canterbury Tales.
Right. I was just thinking that too.
Is all about these stories that are told by these pilgrims going to Canterbury, which was a major religious center in England at the time. People did that. It surprises people today, because we have a perception that in the medieval periods, the peasants were tied to the land. They never went anywhere. They were ignorant. There's truth in that. But also, people were traveling. People, just as they did in the Roman Empire too.
Well, on his journey, his overland journey back, Sigurd actually goes through what's now Kiev in Ukraine, does he not? Right? Remember that, right? Yes.
No, he did not go to Kiev, but he actually did not. But many of the Scandinavians came down through Kiev, because the easiest way to get to the Mediterranean by land was to travel down the rivers in what is now Belarus and the Ukraine. The Dnieper River goes right through Kiev. You can't get to it directly from the Baltic. You have to do some portages, portages coming from the French, where you actually took the ship, you put rollers under it. Usually they would cut trees as rollers, and you actually took it from one body of water, rolled it a number of miles to the next, then sailed down that river, and then you may have to do another portage to another river. But anyway, they came down that route to join the Varangian Guard. Most famous of that was a predecessor of actually connected to Sigurd and his brothers, I don't know, great uncle or something like that, named Harald Hardrada. And he came down. He was exiled because his uncle, who was Olaf, later canonized Saint Olaf, who was the king of Norway at the time, was defeated in a battle from rivals. And so Harald escaped the battle, and obviously now landless, went down, became the chief of the Varangian Guards, became incredibly wealthy, took that wealth, went back up to Norway to be the king of Norway once again, since he had a claim to the crown. He also tried to take the kingdom of Denmark, was defeated, but then went to England, and he was the predecessor. If you recall, in the William the Conqueror's conquest in 1066, Harold Godwin, who was the claimed king of England, had to fight both invasions. First, Harold Hardrada came down from the north. William was coming up from Normandy. Harold decided that Hardrada was the main threat. He went and defeated them. At the same time William was landed, Harold Godwinson took his force, went back down to fight William the Conqueror. By that time, I'm sure they were exhausted. And that was one of the reasons that William was able to defeat him. They had previously fought a very hard battle against the
Mm-hmm.
Norwegians. Now they're coming down against the Normans. These were not coordinated attacks. And a lot of other things were happening in England at the time.
Mm-hmm.
But that's that. Now, Hardrada, in the article, I say Hardrada means severe counselor, which is what kind of the translation, but actually means, pardon my French, hard ass. It was Harold Hardass. He was like his men were afraid of him. He drove them. And so that's how he got the nickname. Hardrada is actually a nickname, rather. It's not a family name. But he was very successful because he was a taught leader.
That's amazing. Yeah, I don't want to get down the rabbit hole, but you're making me think of all these digressions here. Like, that's one of the great what ifs of 1066. What if he'd taken on William's invasion force first instead of being all beat up by Harold before he went down there? How history would have been different.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, the Vikings had great nicknames. My favorite one was always Eric Bloodaxe. I love that.
Mm-hmm.
That's like, that one resonates for me. Anyway, this is a fascinating story, eventful, very eventful journey indeed. Now, you mentioned how Snorri Sturluson's Heimskringla is the principal source of this. Is there a preferred English translation of Snorri Sturluson, or I'm sure there's multiple ones?
Go to a free one. Go to Gutenberg project online,
mm-hmm.
and that has a version of Heimskringla that is the one that I used.
Mm-hmm.
The English translation, it's a good one because it comes from a compilation of translations and from the 1800s. And the translators took the Norse poetry and rhymed it in English. I mean, they didn't.
Oh, wow.
It's an accurate translation, but they poetry rhymes. So they took it. What would have rhymed in Norse wouldn't necessarily rhyme in English,
right.
but they made it rhyme in English. So it's much more entertaining version, I think you would call it.
Check that out. I have the modern anthology. Yeah. Oh, good. I'll check it out. I have the modern anthology, Sagas of the Icelanders, and I think it might be some of it's in there. The whole thing, I'm not sure, but I haven't taken that off the shelf in a while. But that seems like a pretty good modern edition as well. Of those Icelandic sagas are such an important source. When there's an oral tradition, you have to go by those oral hand-me-down accounts when there's nothing else to go by. Luckily, in the case of your story here, it is supported by other European points of view while it was happening. It's chronicled elsewhere as well.
Right. And William of Malmesbury of England contemporary wrote about it. Thomas Monachus, which was a Thomas the monk, who was originally German, wrote about it. There were others who were writing about it, so we don't just have the Norse sagas that comment on it. Now, they didn't necessarily write about all the adventures, but they acknowledge there was this King Sigurd. He came down. He did these sort of things. He ended up with the Holy Land. They conquered Sidon, et cetera, et cetera. So there were a number of European chronicles about it, and there's some commentary by Arab chroniclers at the time too about it, that these Norse people, these strange people, came down to support via ships to support the Crusaders. The only one, I pick on Steve Runciman's version of the Crusades. He has only like one paragraph about Sigurd in his 3 volumes of History of the Crusades. And he actually has a couple of facts wrong. He says that Sigurd visited Castile in Spain, but at the time, Galatia was not part of Castile. It was not till 1230 or sometime that Castile had conquered combined with the Kingdom of Leon. He also makes some other comments, but he doesn't use Sturluson as a source. He uses what is called the Agap of Noreg King Sora Saga, which was another reference, but a very short one to Sigurd. That's contemporary, that's a little bit earlier than Sturluson, but he also relies on some secondary sources in French. So I think that Sturluson's version is much more superior to all the other versions. So, but that's because at the time, the historians writing about the Crusades didn't pay attention to the sea, and there's a lot to it. During the Crusade period and slightly before, the Normans who were conquering southern Italy with Sicily, which was in Muslim hands, and technically could have been considered part of the Crusades, although often it isn't. They developed their version of the tank landing ship. They developed a ship in which they could open up the bow, drop a ramp, and have the knights on horses go directly from the ship into the battle. There's all these maritime aspects happening at the top. It was called Tarifa, was a type of ship. It's actually an Arab term, Tarifa, which is a horse transport ship. So there's these various aspects of the Crusades in the maritime world, and it was the maritime operations that sustained these states, bringing the supplies, bringing the knights, bringing the horses, bringing all the equipment to the Levant, mostly out of Marseille, Barcelona. Those are two big ports. Those were the ones that the Templars used in particular, but also from Sicily, from other ports in Italy. Venetians and their fleet played a big role. Genoese and their fleet played a big role. Pisans from Pisa played a big role. So you have also maritime operations. And up till now, or let's say up till the 1970s, 1980s, a lot of that was neglected. In the 1970s, as I said, there was an Australian scholar named John Pryor who started writing about this, and he focused a lot on the structure of the ships. None survive. We have no surviving examples of the Crusader ships. We do of the Viking longships, but we don't have any plans or anything of the horse transports. We know about them because of what the chroniclers wrote about and described. So it was difficult to study that. But I was also inspired by an article written by an English scholar by the name of John France that was titled "The First Crusade as a Maritime Enterprise." And that kind of inspired me to actually take a look at all these maritime operations that are really understudied. And that one of the elements that made me look at. Another element, and this is personal, is my name, Tangredi, which was originally Tancredi, traces it back to the Crusades. It's an originally Norman French name, came down with the Normans as they conquered southern Italy, became Italianized, and there was several Tancreds that fought in the Crusades or ruled over Sicily, and so that also interested me in this history. You can't trace it back directly. Most of the Crusaders, or many of the Crusaders, had what are called at the time natural children, which meant children out of marriage. So you can't really trace the family lines that well at all because of so many natural children. But the natural children took the surnames once we had surnames. In that period, surnames didn't use surnames. The Tancred came from the original kind of founder of the family in Normandy, who happened to have 10 sons and 6 or so daughters, and one son inherited everything. So the 9 sons had to go adventuring to create their own kingdom. And at least 5 of them went down to Italy, first to serve as mercenaries and then eventually to conquer a whole bunch of stuff. until they created the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, which is confusing because you look on the map, there's only one Sicily. That was Southern Italy and Sicily. So,
how about that?
Was inspired.
You have this history in your veins. That's a whole another interesting angle to it, and I can understand your fascination, additional fascination with it from that.
Right.
But I think also, go ahead, please.
And also the naval, my profession, my naval experience, because you can envision what that was like if you've been at sea and you've dealt with the elements and you've deployed long distances. And what they did is amazing. And the ships that they had, I mean, it took incredible courage to do this sort of thing. But on the other hand, life was thought of differently then. People died very young. The Vikings considered death in battle as very honorable. The two elements, particularly before the Christian era, the two elements was personal honor and comradeship. You gain personal honor by prowess in battle. And then you also develop the comradeship with your fellow warriors. And those were the two things most important to male population at that time. So it was fairly natural for them to get involved in these sorts of activities.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think you're involved in what sounds very much like an emerging historical field, if you will, subfield, if you will. And the fact that there's obviously a rich maritime component and, amphibious type vessels and whatnot involved in the Crusades. And this scholarly speaking, is just barely the surface has been scratched by this. So it's really fascinating to be on the front line of this coming out and reading it. And I feel like you're really onto something with this. And we've loved the installments of your sort of ongoing research that have appeared in the magazine, and we'll certainly look forward to seeing more of them as more of these develop. It's just endlessly fascinating. And I would just close with reminding people that Sam here is a very prolific and prize-winning contributor of both proceedings and naval history, and is very much a part of the reliable stable of contributors to both magazines and both fronts, historical and the current and the future. You cover all the bases, Sam. Oh, also, most probably know this in our sphere, but you're now the editor-in-chief of the Naval War College Review. Congratulations on that. That's a very prestigious publication. We've always loved it.
Well, that's a very scholarly publication. Very different than the focus on how naval history or even proceedings we accept mostly long, 5,000 to 10,000 word scholarly contributions. If any of your listeners have that sort of contributions, I'm also bringing back two features. One is called Research and Debate, which is a shorter, very well-researched article type thing of about 3,000 words or 3,500 words, which is the sort of thing Proceedings does. But, the same sort of, I don't want to say 100 citations, but the same thing, but only shorter and focusing on sort of a controversial view of current operations or the future or history. And then something I call that was previously called Set and Drift, which is basically a much shorter 2,000 words of usually by a practitioner about naval operations of short, because the feedback I get on the journal, and I've only done one issue thus far, edited one issue thus far, and it's online. Go to the Naval War College website or just Google Naval War College Review, and it takes you to that site. The print editions have not been printed yet. And one of the things I inherited in this job is a big budget cut. So I have to manage that. But if people want to look online, what we're doing now, and there's certain things that we're doing that is a little bit different. We feature the authors' names on the cover, which was never done before, because I want people to look at it and say, oh, I like that guy's writing. We combined scholars, some from the Naval War College, but mostly from outside, with practitioners. And I'm looking at some of the noted naval authors too to contribute to. Upcoming issue has a big review essay by Norman Friedman. So we want to combine that so that if you pick up the journal and you're not necessarily someone who will read a 9,000 scholarly treatment of something, you have other things that will be of interest. But the one thing about the review, its job is to take precise, very intensive analysis, scholarly work on a naval related subject as kind of the basis for the people, for new concepts, for the work that OpNav does, maybe the joint staff does. We're providing the basic research on those topics, and then others will take them and promulgate them or by writing about them in proceedings, in a more attractive way. We're doing the basic research. That's what we publish. We publish the basic research. There's some excellent articles on how the Navy determined to defeat the kamikaze threat. There's, in the current issue, just out, one of your authors and Naval Institute Press authors, Len Heinz, has an excellent article on the development of SG radar in the Solomon campaign. And you say, it sounds like a very technical subject, but what that did was it created the concept of the CIC, Combat Identification Center. That whole concept came from the use of this radar in the Solomons campaign. And Len lays it out very precisely, went through all the sources, including combat narratives and stuff, very well. And what I view as my mission, as opposed to what you're doing, what Bill Hamlet does, is I get that basic, long, precise research, and hopefully it becomes into the defense dialogue, overall defense dialogue. But generally what it does is others who write for proceedings or naval history or whatever use that as a resource, and then kind of refine that in ways that the concepts can be derived and be useful today, or bring ideas to the reader. In my own writing, what I try to do is very much that. I do publish scholarly articles with 150 citations, that sort of thing. But what I really like to do is take that and write it in a way that an interested reader who's not a scholar, who doesn't want to read a 10,000 word explanation on a very specific subject, can benefit from that. It's the goal, I think, is to take a scholarly topic and present it the way that, like, Jim Hornfisher or Ian Toll or Rich Frank does, or Vince O'Hara does, in a way that readers enjoy. History is not what happened. History is what people remember. And they're going to remember Jim Hornfisher's books long before they remember a very precise 10,000 word article in Naval War College Review, because of the style of writing. And going back to the Crusades, one of the reasons that we interpret the Crusades in the way that Steve Runciman did, because he was a good writer. In fact, he said, I'm a writer of literature, not really a historian. So my argument is the person who writes the best about history usually gets the information to the audience in ways that scholarly writing doesn't necessarily. Now, today, using the web and influencers and stuff, you could get conspiracy theories out there very easily. My fear is, since people are using social media and stuff, that eventually history will be a string of conspiracy theories, like the Templars ruling the world and having a treasure and all that sort of thing, which has absolutely no sources whatsoever. Just suppositions and stuff. Civilizations helped, the pyramids built by aliens, the web is full of that, and most of it has absolutely no sources. They are interpretations of things that could be interpreted many different ways. My fear is that history, as far as people remembers, what people remember won't be very accurate.
Oh boy, that's a nightmare scenario. But you know what? You bring up something that has always been sort of a thing for me, is all that stuff's out there. Aliens inventing the summer vacation or whatever. Make up something, right? Real history is so much more interesting. There's so much there. No matter how much you know, there's more to know. How can you worry about this obvious hocus pocus carnival sideshow stuff when there's this meaty panoply of human experience that's real history that you're never going to learn all of, no matter how much you learn? So that's why I've always been a little mystified by that. But it makes for good quasi documentaries, right?
Right.
Well, go ahead.
And I fault many of the trade publishers, because they publish things like about the Templars and about the Chinese creating the Renaissance and
right.
circumnavigating.
And then you always see the grandiose subtitle that claims how such and such changed all of the world. It's always this grandiose, overstated subtitle.
And also many of them aren't really history, in the sense that they're not.
No.
They don't have sources. They have assumptions based on some sort of factoid, and then take that. A good example is the argument that ancient peoples or even medieval peoples had discovered Antarctica because there is this map.
The Piri Reis map, right.
Yeah, but what people don't realize is that map makers at the time didn't want blank spaces. And also the Greeks had a theory that the world was balanced. So if there was a continent here, that would be continent there. So if you look at the Piri Reis map, that's basically the southern end of South America, kind of made as a blob because it balanced off things. There's no indication that ancient peoples had ever gotten to Antarctica, and certainly the Atlanteans didn't end up in Antarctica. So, but these books are published as if they're history, because they make a lot of money for the trade publishers. That's why you need Naval Institute Press to publish real histories.
Yes, amen for that. Just like there's a lot of junk science out there, there's a lot of junk history too. And we'll just leave it at lamented that, because that's a whole other kettle of fish. But Sam, thank you. Good luck with the Naval War College Review. As you point out, this has always been a very valuable resource for baseline scholarship upon which other things can stand. You mentioned Len Hines. He's having a good month. He's in the upcoming March-April issue of Naval History Magazine as well. So way to go, Len. He's got a foot in each camp, which is the way you want
Len
to see.
is a fine scholar and writer,
yes,
and of course a good collaborator with Vince O'Hara, who is an amazing writer too. Yeah, we don't compete with you in naval history.
Oh no,
we are something different.
Very symbiotic. It always has been. Very symbiotic.
We supplement each other. Yeah, we supplement each other. And as soon as I get the I'll be excited about this job once I get the budget issues solved, the personnel issues solved. The journal was about 3 issues behind. We are caught up now with the last issue, but because it is a government publication, it is free to those American citizens who want to receive it and for those, if I have the money to print that many copies. So it's a whole different game than if you're running a publication that is sold for profit or finance. So we're in a much different situation, which is both good and bad. The other thing that unless authors actually do their own work on it, nothing in the Naval War College Review is copyright. Because government publications cannot be copyright. They belong to the American people. So those who want to copy articles from it, as long as the author has not gone through the process of copyrighting that specific article, and the publication is open, and then the authors who are military or government employees or whatever can't copyright their articles. So this is a very open publication. It's published online. Every issue of Naval War College Review is now online, has been scanned online. So people who go to the website can read the articles. It's not the same experience as holding the journal in your hands and reading it like a book. Part of the budget issue is that the idea that everybody reads everything online. Well, people will read individual articles online. Scholars will Google it, but very few people read an entire journal online. You're talking 180 pages, particularly if it's topics that don't strike them as interesting. What we want to do is we want people to read the entire thing, because they'll find that the topics they did not consider of personal interest are quite good, and will benefit from that. There was an issue a few years ago that had an outstanding article on Dutch maritime painters who went and painted in England for the Royal Navy and for the King. And you say, well, that's Dutch maritime painters. Why would I? What interest? And it's so well written and it's so interesting. And my fear is if you leave everything online and you don't have a print edition, people will not ever experience that. And it's and so I really do believe in the both online and print.
Oh, same here. And they both serve their purpose. And the fact that you've got all of the War College reviews, back issues and everything, it's all there. That is a massively valuable digital resource for research. And I look forward to delving in there myself. And I very much look forward to going on after this and seeing the current issue now that it's there. And thank you for all you're doing with that. That's important work. And thank you for all you're doing with us. And it's been a blast spending this cold, snowy hour talking with you about medieval history. It's a perfect kind of scenario while I'm looking out the window here for this. And look forward to seeing you again, Sam. And we look forward to more from you in the magazine. Keep up the great work on all fronts. And it's been a pleasure talking with you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure, Eric. And good luck to you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Well, that's it for us for today, folks. But I wish you all fair winds and following seas.